"Don't worry about him," said Jessica Harmon with a small, effortless laugh. "He just fixes things." The room chuckled with her. 11 people around a conference table that probably cost more than Colin Ashworth's truck, his toolbox, and 6 months of groceries combined. They were laughing at a man in gray coveralls who was crouched by the wall panel near the door, replacing a faulty thermostat sensor. Before the formal session began, he didn't look up. He finished tightening the panel screw, gathered his tools, and walked out without a word. What none of them knew, not Jessica Harmon, not the 4 international delegations she was about to address, not a single person in that glass and steel building on the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona, was that the man who fixed their thermostat had spent 9 years negotiating aerospace contracts in the same countries those delegates had flown in from. In the same languages they were already beginning to murmur among themselves quietly, the way people do when they think no one in the room can follow. Nobody at Meridian Aerospace Systems had ever asked, and Colin Ashworth had never felt the need to tell them. He was 46 years old. He had been working as a facilities maintenance technician at Meridian for 3 years. Before that, for the move to Tucson, the smaller house, the quieter schedule, the truck that needed new brake pads, he had been something else entirely. But that was the kind of information that lived in a file cabinet nobody opened, and Colin did not spend much energy correcting what people assumed about him. His daughter's name was Isabel. She was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's way of going very still when she was thinking hard about something. She had been in 2nd grade when her mother, Patricia, died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday afternoon. No warning, no build-up, no chance to say the things that needed saying. Isabel had been at school. Colin had been in Rotterdam on the 2nd day of a contract review meeting with a Dutch-German industrial consortium. He had taken the first flight home. He had not gone back. 5 passports lived in a fireproof box in the closet of the 2nd bedroom, which was technically a home office but mostly held Isabel's overflow of art supplies and the occasional school project on a drying rack. 4 countries' entry visas, stamps from airports Colin could walk blindfolded. He didn't look at them often. Isabel had found them once, 2 years ago, and had spent a Saturday afternoon making him describe every stamp, partly in English, partly in whatever language matched the ink, until she fell asleep on the couch with a Japanese phrase still half-formed on her lips. He taught her languages the way some fathers teach card tricks. A little every day without pressure, as a game. At breakfast they might practice colors in Mandarin. At dinner, numbers in Arabic, because Isabel liked the way certain sounds felt in her mouth and would repeat them until they became automatic. She was 8 and already moved between English and Spanish without thinking. Because her best friend Paloma had a grandmother who spoke only Spanish, and Isabel had decided, with the complete pragmatic logic of childhood, that she needed to understand what was being said at birthday parties. Colin drove Isabel to school at 7:30 every morning and picked her up at 3:15 every afternoon. Those were the 2 non-negotiable facts around which he had organized his entire working life when he took the job at Meridian. The other condition was that he would never travel overnight. Both had been met without discussion, because a facilities technician was not the kind of position that required overnight travel, and because Colin had chosen that position for exactly that reason. His colleagues on the maintenance crew had formed their understanding of him in the first few weeks and saw no cause to update it. Quiet, competent, showed up early, volunteered for the inconvenient jobs, brought Isabel a small wrapped lunch every day in a bag she had decorated herself with iron-on patches of planets and animals. On the corner of his workbench in the maintenance bay, between a socket wrench set and a clipboard of work orders, sat a Korean grammar workbook, a German-Portuguese phrase dictionary with a broken spine, and a small spiral notebook filled with handwritten vocabulary in Arabic. His supervisor, Dale Pruitt, had noticed these once and made a joke about Colin taking night classes. Colin had smiled and said something non-committal. Dale had moved on. Nobody asked what the notebook was for. Jessica Harmon had been appointed COO of Meridian Aerospace Systems 14 months ago at 33, after the company was acquired by a larger defense conglomerate that wanted younger leadership in its subsidiaries. She had an MBA from Stanford and a background in corporate restructuring, and she had taken the role with the clear intention of proving that a company known primarily for its mid-century aeronautical legacy could become a serious competitor in the emerging market for AI-assisted flight navigation systems. She was not a bad person. She was precisely the kind of person who had spent a decade being told that her credentials were the most important thing about her, and had come to believe it. She had walked past Colin Ashworth's maintenance cart approximately 60 times in 14 months and had never registered his face. The contract that brought the international delegations to Tucson was a joint development agreement for a new AI navigation safety system. Meridian had been building for 3 years. Valued at just over $90 million across a 5-year deployment cycle, it involved partners from Germany, Japan, South Korea, and the UAE, a German aeronautical engineering firm, a Japanese avionics manufacturer, a South Korean aerospace systems company, and an Emirati aviation infrastructure group. If finalized, it would be the largest international partnership in Meridian's history and the centerpiece of Jessica Harmon's tenure. She had prepared for the meeting with the comprehensive thoroughness of someone who understood what was at stake. Technical briefings, financial modeling, cultural sensitivity training for the executive team, a contracted translation service for all written materials. She had thought of everything. The morning of the meeting, Colin's assignment was to ensure the climate control in the 4th floor conference suite was functioning correctly, that the AV system was running without issues, and that the presentation terminal had been tested. He arrived at 5:40 and was done by 7:15. The thermostat sensor near the east wall had been running warm for 2 days, so he replaced it before the delegates arrived. That was the task he was finishing when Jessica Harmon walked in with her team at 7:50 and made her offhand comment about the air conditioning. He left the room. He went back to the maintenance bay, poured himself a cup of coffee from the machine that hadn't worked correctly since February, the one he'd been submitting repair requests about since March, and sat down at his bench with his work order list for the day. He didn't think about the comment. It wasn't the kind of thing he spent energy on. At 9 o'clock, the international delegates began arriving. Colin knew this because the facilities team had been briefed on the parking arrangements and building access protocols, and because he passed through the 4th floor hallway twice that morning and observed the delegations being ushered into the conference suite with the careful choreography of a meeting someone had been planning for a long time. He noticed in passing that the Japanese delegation was 3 people, the German 2, the Korean 2, and the Emirati Group 3. He noticed the language of their pre-meeting conversations, the way they sorted naturally into their own tongues in the hallway before the formal session required English of everyone. He understood all of it. He kept walking. What happened at 2:17 in the afternoon was the kind of system failure that announces itself quietly before it becomes catastrophic. Colin was on the 3rd floor replacing a ballast in a fluorescent fixture when his radio crackled with a call from Brett, the facilities coordinator, who spoke in the particular tone of someone who had just been yelled at by someone above his pay grade. The AV system in Conference Suite 4 was malfunctioning. Could Colin get up there as fast as possible? He got up there. The meeting had been running for about 4 hours when the demonstration segment began to unravel. Meridian's AI navigation safety system relied on a multilingual processing engine, the core technology that allowed the system to interface with flight control communications in different languages and regional aviation standards simultaneously. The live demonstration was supposed to show the 4 partner groups how the system would handle real-time flight status data flowing between air traffic control hubs operating in different languages. The first demonstration sequence, originating from the German partner's data format, processed correctly. Then the system was handed a simulated Korean air traffic advisory, a routing deviation notification from Gimpo International, and the AI's output, displayed on the main screen for everyone in the room, translated it as a weather delay warning with a low priority classification. The lead Korean delegate, a composed man named Mr. Baek, looked at the screen and said something in Korean to his colleague that was short and careful and contained the particular flatness of professional alarm. His colleague replied in Korean. The reply was longer. It was not reassuring. The German delegate, Dr. Kirsch, turned to the woman beside him and said something quickly that included the phrase Sicherheitsrelevant, safety relevant, and nicht akzeptabel. The Emirati delegation's senior representative leaned toward his associate and spoke in Gulf Arabic, a short sentence that translated to something close to, "This is a classification failure, not a display error." The Japanese team said nothing aloud, but the lead delegate, a precise and measured man named Mr. Tanaka, set his pen down on the table in a way that communicated everything his expression was being careful not to. Jessica Harmon's head of technical operations, Craig Weston, was already at his laptop, typing fast, face white. The demonstration refreshed. The same mistranslation appeared. He typed faster. Jessica stood at the front of the room and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 14 months building toward a single moment, that the moment was collapsing. What she did not understand was why. Her technical team clearly didn't understand why either, which meant they couldn't fix it in any time frame that would salvage the afternoon. She was watching $90 million and 3 years of work dissolve in real time, and nobody in the room could tell her how to stop it. Colin had come in through the side door with his radio and a diagnostic tablet. The AV issue Brett had called about was specifically the HDMI switching matrix routing signals to the main display. He had been standing near the equipment rack in the back of the room for approximately 4 minutes, doing what the facilities team was supposed to do in executive meetings. Present without being present, invisible by professional convention. In those 4 minutes he had heard every language in the room. He had understood every word. He understood the Korean delegates' concern. He understood the German delegates. He understood the Emirati representatives' specific worry about classification integrity. He understood the Japanese delegates' silence, which, in that context, was louder than the others. He also understood the error, because it was one he had seen before, not at Meridian, but 9 years ago, in an early prototype of a multilingual flight data processing system being tested by the maritime conglomerate he'd worked for then. The AI's training data had conflated Korean aviation routing codes with meteorological advisory codes because the two systems used an overlapping numerical classification structure in the Korean Civil Aviation Bureau's legacy documentation. The system wasn't broken. It was misreading a very specific edge case in the source data and misrouting the output classification. He knew this the way he knew which socket wrench fit which bolt, from having worked inside it once, in a different life. Craig Weston moved to the front of the room to address the delegates. He spoke in English with the careful confidence of someone trying to seem more certain than he was. He explained that the error was limited to the demonstration environment. The Korean delegate said, politely and precisely, the demonstration environment uses the same processing architecture as the live deployment. Can you confirm the error does not exist in production? Craig could not confirm that. His expression confirmed he could not confirm that. Dr. Kirsch removed his reading glasses and set them on the table. He said, in English, "We have a significant concern about the integrity of the multilingual processing module. I think we need to pause this session." Colin set down his diagnostic tablet. He was standing at the back of a room full of people, none of whom had any reason to believe he was anything other than the man who had been fixing the thermostat that morning. He was aware of this. He was also aware that the delegates were about to formally withdraw from a session that could still be recovered. Not because the technology was fundamentally broken, but because nobody in the room was speaking to them. In a way that told the truth and that they had reason to trust. He walked forward. Craig Weston saw him coming and said, with the full institutional authority of a senior director addressing a maintenance technician, "This isn't your area. You can go." Colin stopped. He was in the middle of the room now, between Craig and the conference table. He looked at Craig. He looked at Jessica, who was watching from 15 feet away, with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then he turned to Dr. Kirsch and his German colleague and spoke in German. Not textbook German. Not the careful, constructed German of a language learner reading from a phrase. The German of someone who had argued contract language in Hamburg and Frankfurt for years, who knew the difference between how an engineer and a lawyer used the word Sicherheit, who understood that the most important thing to say first, to a German technical delegation, was not a reassurance, but a precise statement of what had actually gone wrong. He told them, in German, that the error was in the training data classification overlap between Korean KCAB routing codes and meteorological advisory codes in the Korean legacy aviation documentation format, that it was not a flaw in the core processing logic, but a known edge case in multilingual aviation data integration, correctable, and not reflective of the system's fundamental reliability. The room had gone entirely quiet, not the conversational quiet of a pause. The deeper quiet of a room where something unexpected has just happened and everyone is deciding what to do with it. Dr. Kirsch stared at him, then he said in German, "You understand this system." It was not a question. Colin turned to the Korean delegates and continued in Korean, formal professional Korean, the register used in high-stakes technical discussions, precise and respectful. He addressed the specific concern Mr. Back had expressed when the error first appeared, whether a classification failure of this type would propagate through the full routing chain or remain isolated. He explained that the error was bounded, told them exactly where in the data architecture it originated, and described the specific corrective measure that would address it. Mr. Back looked at him for a long moment, then said something brief to his colleague. His colleague nodded. Colin spoke to the Emirati delegation in Arabic, Gulf dialect, the cadences of Dubai's technical and business culture, where directness and relationship are not opposites but partners. He told them, in Arabic, that the company had a real problem, and that he was standing in front of them to tell them the exact truth about it, because that was the only way to have an honest conversation about whether it was solvable. The Emirati representative was quiet for a moment. Then he said in Arabic, "That is the first honest thing we have heard in 4 hours." Colin moved to the Japanese delegation. He spoke to Mr. Tanaka in formal business Japanese, the specific grammatical register that signals both technical knowledge and respectful acknowledgement of the other party's concerns. He described the data error in terms that mapped to the technical framework Mr. Tanaka's team had been working within, acknowledged the reliability concern the delegation had raised during the earlier demo sequence, and explained precisely what a corrective integration audit would involve and how long it would take. Mr. Tanaka listened without expression. When Colin finished, he inclined his head. A small, deliberate movement that in Japanese professional culture carries more weight than most verbal acknowledgments. Colin had spoken for 11 minutes, moving between 4 languages the way someone moves through rooms of a house they know well. Not translating, not switching modes, simply continuing in whatever the next room required. When he stopped, the French side systems auditor, who had not said a word in the last 20 minutes, said quietly, in French, "Remarkable." Colin hadn't addressed him. He did so now, briefly, confirming that the auditor's notation on page 41 of the integration framework was flagging the right field and that his instinct about the scope of the correction was accurate. The French observer blinked. "You read French technical documentation?" "Yes," Colin said. Jessica Harmon had not moved from her position near the window. She had been watching for 11 minutes, with the particular stillness of someone processing something too large to respond to in real time. She had spent 14 months building a company's international credibility. She had hired consultants and translation services and brought in cultural advisors. She had prepared for this meeting with the thoroughness of someone who believed that thoroughness was the same as readiness. The person currently holding the meeting together was the man she had laughed at in front of 11 people that morning for fixing the air conditioning. The next hour was unlike anything Colin had experienced inside a conference room in 3 years. And, unlike most things he'd seen in the 9 before that, he worked through the technical problem methodically, explaining the error to Craig Weston's team in terms they could act on, walking the German and Korean delegates jointly through the data architecture to demonstrate the error's boundaries, addressing each delegation's specific concerns in their own language, while simultaneously ensuring the technical team understood what each delegation needed to hear in order to move from withdrawal back toward engagement. At one point, he went to the whiteboard and wrote out the specific data field classification causing the conflict, annotating it in Korean, German, and English simultaneously, so that both the technical team and the international partners could follow the same explanation without a translation buffer. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was just the most efficient way to make sure everyone in the room was talking about the same thing. By 4 o'clock, all 4 delegations were still seated. The contract was still alive. Nobody in that room had any doubt about why. After the delegates were escorted to their vehicles, Jessica Harmon sat alone in the empty conference suite for almost 30 minutes. She sat in a chair at the middle of the table, not at the head where she usually positioned herself, and looked at the whiteboard Colin had written on, which nobody had erased yet, and thought about a number of things she had been wrong about. That evening she accessed his personnel file. It had been transferred from the Phoenix Beach regional office when Colin came on as a facilities hire and sat in the HR system with no particular flag to indicate anyone should look at it closely. She read for an hour. The degree in aerospace engineering from Georgia Tech, the master's in international systems management from Johns Hopkins, the 9 years at Vantage Aviation Partners, one of the largest global aerospace logistics firms in the industry, with a final title 3 full levels above his current position, 4 languages listed under professional competencies, which was apparently an undercount. 2 industry commendations for cross-cultural technical negotiation. A letter from a German aeronautical firm she recognized, describing Colin Ashworth's contribution to a 2016 multinational contract review, in terms that made her aware, in a specific and uncomfortable way, that she had laughed at this person in front of witnesses. At the bottom of the employment record, in the departure field, 2 words: personal circumstances. She sat with that for a long time. On Saturday morning, she drove to the address in the employee file, a single-story house on a quiet street on Tucson's east side, and rang the doorbell. A girl answered, dark-eyed, 8 years old, wearing a T-shirt with a diagram of the solar system on it, and called for her father. When Colin came to the door, his expression was the same careful, close-read expression Jessica had been seeing for 3 days. Not guarded, exactly, but not open either. The expression of a person who has learned to wait before deciding what something means. She said she wanted to talk. He invited her in. The house was the kind where things had been chosen because they were useful, and where every room showed evidence of an actual life being lived inside it. Isabel's drawings were taped to the kitchen wall in a long, overlapping row. The dining table had a half-finished puzzle on one end and a stack of library books on the other. On the refrigerator, held by a cactus magnet, was a drawing Isabel had made of herself and her father standing in front of an airplane. She had labeled it at the bottom in English and Japanese, and what appeared to be the beginning of a Korean word. Isabel herself appeared from around the corner with the frank, unembarrassed curiosity of a child who has no particular reason yet to be cautious around strangers. "Are you from Daddy's work?" she asked. Jessica said yes. Isabel considered this. "Are you the one who said he just fixes things?" Jessica felt the question like a hand pressing on her sternum. She looked at the drawings on the wall, the vocabulary flashcards, in a basket on the counter, the Korean grammar book with its spine creased from being opened flat countless times. "Yes," she said, "I was wrong." Isabel seemed to find this an acceptable answer. She disappeared back around the corner. Colin made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table and talked. Not the conversation of a supervisor and a subordinate, and not the conversation of two people who have figured out how to be comfortable with each other, but the conversation of two people being honest, without the usual professional insulation, which was harder and more useful than either of the other options. She asked him why he hadn't said anything in 3 years, in all the months he had worked in that building, with 4 languages and 9 years of aerospace contract work sitting unreferenced in his head. He said that nobody had asked. She started to say something about that, and then stopped herself, because whatever she was going to say sounded, even before she said it, like a deflection. Instead, she said, "I looked at your file last night." He nodded once. "The German contract from 2016, the Vantage Partnership, I recognized the firm." "Yes. Why did you leave?" He was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen doorway they could both hear Isabel in the other room, saying something to herself in Korean syllables, slowly testing the sound. "Patricia died," he said, "and then it was just Isabel and me, and I needed to be somewhere that let me be her father more than it needed me to be anything else." Jessica sat with that. Outside the kitchen window, a pair of mourning doves were working at something in the yard, methodical and unhurried. "I want to offer you a role," she said. "A real one. International contract management. You'd lead the multilingual technical review team for the new partnership, senior director level. The compensation would—" "I won't take that," Colin said. She had prepared herself for this. "Tell me why." "That role would need someone who could prioritize the company," he said. "I prioritize Isabel. I chose that arrangement deliberately, and I'm not interested in undoing it." He paused. "I'd be glad to take on an advisory role. International technical communication, cross-cultural contract review, whatever the team needs that fits inside a schedule Isabel's life is built around. The work would be good. The title doesn't matter." Jessica looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The compensation for the advisory role will reflect what you're actually contributing, not the title." He said that was fine. 3 weeks after the summit session, Colin was reviewing integration logs as part of his new informal support role on the international contracts team when he found something that didn't belong. A system audit flag from 5 weeks before the meeting. A junior engineer named Priya Nandakumar had flagged the exact same Korean data classification error he had identified in the conference room. Her flag had been escalated once and reached the desk of Roy Alderman, Meridian's chief technology officer, who was also, a fact Colin verified across several separate documents, the executive most publicly associated with the contract signing timeline, and the holder of a stock option package tied specifically to a major international contract being finalized before the end of the fiscal quarter. The option value, if exercised at the expected share price, was worth approximately $3.5 million. Roy Alderman had accessed Priya Nandakumar's flag, written his own resolution notation, moved her original report into an archived compliance folder, and approved the contract timeline to proceed on schedule. Colin pulled the associated emails, 3 of them from 8 months earlier, in which Roy had communicated to the compensation committee about the option trigger conditions. The math was not complicated. He brought the documentation to Jessica. Not accusations, timestamps, file paths, correspondence records, Priya Nandakumar's original technical report with her analysis, which was identical in its conclusion to his own. He laid it on the table and let the document speak. Jessica listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How long have you known?" He said he had suspected for several days. He had wanted to be certain before bringing it to her directly. She nodded. "Thank you for coming to me first." She meant it. The board meeting was held the following week. Jessica presented the findings herself. Roy Alderman reframed the situation as a procedural oversight, a communication failure, a rushed timeline, an explanation that might have partially held, except that 2 of the 4 international partner delegations were patched in by video at Jessica's request to provide their direct account of the summit session. Mr. Back confirmed that his delegation had been on the verge of formally withdrawing. Dr. Kirsch confirmed the same. When the board asked who had provided the intervention that kept the partnership intact, both delegates said the same name. When the board then asked why that person had not been identified as a language and technical resource prior to the summit, nobody in the room offered a satisfying explanation. Roy Alderman resigned before the end of the day. Priya Nandakumar received a formal apology, a retroactive performance bonus, and a place on the newly formed AI Systems Review Committee. Her name appeared at the top of the corrective action report as the first person to identify the problem because she was, and because it should have mattered when she did. The advisory role Colin had agreed to turned out to require more than it had sounded like at the kitchen table, in the way that useful work often does. He was in a meeting 3 mornings a week and available by phone on the others. He reviewed international contract language, flagged translation register issues before they became liability clauses, and worked with Meridian's engineering team on the multilingual processing module audit the partner delegations had requested as a condition of moving forward. He picked Isabel up at 3:15 every afternoon. The evening of Meridian's end-of-year partner reception, held at an events venue with a long view of the Tucson mountains going purple in the late sun. Isabel came with him because his usual sitter had a family thing, and because Isabel, when informed she would need to stay home, had argued her case in English and Spanish, and then switched to Japanese when she sensed the first 2 weren't fully working, which Colin had ultimately found too logistically impressive to override. She arrived in a dress she had selected herself, which had pockets and what she called real flag colors, not just stripes, and she spent the first part of the evening at a small table near the window, sorting through a set of language flashcards she'd brought in her jacket pocket, organizing them into piles by country. Mr. Tanaka's colleague from the Japanese delegation, a younger man named Hiroshi, who had been at the original summit, found her there and crouched down to see what she was doing. They exchanged a few words. Isabel, it turned out, knew more Japanese than most people had given her credit for. Hiroshi looked pleased about this in a way that didn't require translation. Later in the evening, a woman who had just joined Meridian's domestic operations team knew enough that she was still mapping the social architecture of the company, found herself standing near Colin at the edge of the room during a quiet moment and asked with the open directness of someone who doesn't yet know the story, "So what do you actually do here?" Jessica Harmon, who happened to be close enough to hear, paused the conversation she was in. She looked across the room at Colin for a moment before she answered. "He is the most capable person in this building," she said, "and also the most patient with people who were slow to figure that out." Colin looked at her briefly. He did not disagree with her, and he did not agree with her, which was its own kind of response. Then Isabel was at his elbow, holding up a flashcard with the Korean word for mountain, and telling him, in rapid Japanese, that Hiroshi had taught her a new word and could they practice it on the drive home. Colin laughed, a real laugh, the unguarded kind that only came when Isabel was the reason for it, and said yes in Japanese, then repeated it in Korean for practice, which made Isabel scrunch up her face and laugh back in Spanish for no reason except that it made him smile. Around them, the room of engineers and executives and delegates and new hires moved through the ordinary warmth of an evening that was going well. The mountains outside held the last of the light. Isabel sorted her flashcards with the focused pleasure of someone who finds the names of things genuinely interesting, and Colin Ashworth stood at the edge of a room that had once laughed at him and felt, with complete quietness, exactly like himself. There is a kind of knowledge that cannot be listed on a form. It lives in the years a person spent inside a language rather than studying it, inside a culture rather than reading about it, inside a life that required them to be present in ways that credential systems don't measure and hiring committees don't ask about. It cannot be dismissed. It can only be overlooked, and only for as long as no one needs it. Colin Ashworth had always known what he was worth. He had spent 3 years being comfortable with the fact that no one else did. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in a 4th-floor conference room in Tucson, Arizona, the truth had simply done what it eventually always does. It had become impossible to ignore.